Alexander the Great changed a few boundaries and killed a few men. Both he and Napoleon were forced into fame by circumstances outside of themselves and by currents of the time. But Margaret Sanger made currents and circumstances. When the history of our civilization is written, it will be a biological history, and Margaret Sanger will be its heroine. So wrote H.G. Wells in Margaret Sanger, Pioneer of the Future. And this is Atheist History Week. And I'm John Rafferty, president of the Secular Humanist Society of New York, and also a proud and active member of New York City Atheists, which produces this show. Each week at this time, we review the events of this particular week. We're in the second week in September, roughly, and events that happened during this second week in the course of history, births and deaths and notable accomplishments of people, famous, not so famous, infamous, the forgotten sometimes, who made their mark or did something interesting during that particular time frame. We also look at events like conferences and international get-togethers of all kinds, and publishing dates and the premieres of plays that were important, that kind of thing. And also, of course, religious fun and games like burnings at the stake and witch hunts and the like. We begin, as I already have, this week with the story of Margaret Sanger. She was born September 14th in 1879. Her birth name was Higgins. And watching her mother die at the age of 48 of tuberculosis after bearing 11 children changed not only her life, but the world, because she made a huge difference. As a child, she found out about the power of the church when she expected to hear Robert Green Ingersoll speak at a particular church, and found that the local priest had literally barred the door, put a bar across the door so that Ingersoll could not speak in Corning, New York. But of course, Margaret went out of her way, and she did hear Ingersoll speak, and she called it spellbinding. And of course, in her own life later on, she would repeatedly experience being barred from public halls and schools and churches where she was not allowed to speak. Why not? Because she talked about birth control. And in America, at the turn of the 20th century, talking about birth control was called birth control methods, devices, tools, and the description of any of those thereof was called indecent articles under the 1873 Comstock Act. Anthony Comstock, some of you will know, was the great blue-nose Puritan who screwed up this country for 30 or 40 years by having so many different repressive acts, and particularly in Massachusetts and New England. Sanger was active and worked and was trying to spread the doctrine of birth control until she became really radicalized. She had a patient named Sadie Sachs who died from a second illegal abortion. A 28-year-old woman. She had pleaded with her doctor for birth control. The doctor's answer was, "Tell Jake to sleep on the roof." Nice guy, huh? Sanger researched contraception on her own. As a matter of fact, she coined the phrase birth control herself. And all the while she was editing a monthly newspaper, The Woman Rebel, whose only purpose was to challenge the Comstock Act, and which prevented dissemination of contraceptive information. She was indicted under the act. She might have gone to jail? No, to prison for 45 years if she hadn't run away. She left behind a book called Family Limitation, and I'm assuming to the Blue Nose's horror, it sold 10 million copies, while Sanger lived in England and the Netherlands and continued to write. 10 million copies in a nation of probably about 100 million people at the time. That's amazing. When her younger daughter, Sanger's younger daughter Peggy died of pneumonia in November of 1915, she was devastated, but it radicalized her even further, and she decided to fight, which she did. And she came back to America. She opened her first birth control clinic that year, and she spent the next 2 decades educating physicians about birth control and overseeing the creation of birth control clinics around America. She had to actually teach physicians how birth control could work. They didn't know because it was indecent to even study that. She brought the lawsuit that in 1934 eventually overturned the Comstock Act. And but during her lifetime, she was jailed 8 times, brought diaphragms to the United States for the first time. She did herself. And she commissioned the creation of the birth control pill. She did more to free women than any other individual, and was hailed as the heroine of history by H.G. Wells in the quote that I opened this broadcast with. And she was named Woman of the Century by several different magazines during the year of her death. Margaret Sanger. Another woman, freethinker, that we ought to give a great deal of attention to, was Jessica Mitford. Born September 11th, 1917. And if you're of my generation old, you will remember the absolute stunning event of 1963, aside from the death of John Kennedy, which was the publication of The American Way of Death. Jessica Mitford investigated the funeral industry in America. Most people didn't even realize there was a funeral industry. Most people certainly didn't realize that the funeral industry was raping the American public. That even in 1953, a working class or middle class burial would cost Americans thousands of dollars in those years when a pretty decent income was $7,000 or $8,000 a year, and people were laying out $3,000 and $4,000 for funerals, not because they wanted to, but because the funeral industry had lobbied to have laws passed in practically all the states for craziness, like even if you were going to be cremated, you had to have you had to be embalmed. Laws that guaranteed that people would have to pay exorbitant amounts of money to be cremated. So she also described in sickening detail what happens to bodies that are buried after embalmed. Matter of fact, before you got to that chapter, which was in the middle of the book, she warned you, if you've got a weak stomach, skip the next chapter. So, of course, we all read it, and we were all off our feed for several days thereafter. At any rate, Jessica Mitford, queen of the muckrakers. She was born into that eccentric, religious, aristocratic family, the Mitfords. Her parents were dreadful anti-Semites and fascists, and two of her sisters became high-profile fascists, but Jessica took off in the other direction, and she became a novelist, writing a book that has been pretty much in print ever since, Love in a Cold Climate, and was made into a pretty interesting movie. She got all involved in all the mid-century left-wing events, the Spanish Civil War, World War II, and all the rest of it. Here in America, she led the white women's delegation to Mississippi, seeking to save a black defendant from the death penalty. And she and her husband became communists until 1958. And she was summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee, gave them a hard time. And when her book came out, when The American Way of Death came out, it caused such a furor that it eventually led to government regulation of the industry, and a huge increase in the number of people who started to stipulate that they wanted to be cremated rather than buried after they read about what happens to bodies after they die. She wrote a bunch of other books, and she finally died at age 78 of cancer, and departed this world in a $475 cremation. The end of Jessica Mitford, whose lifelong humor and unorthodoxy are remembered. And what, as she was called, the Queen of the Muckrakers, and she loved the title, and her own motto in life pretty much was, you may not be able to change the world, but at least you can embarrass the guilty. Not bad. Jessica Mitford, born September 11, 1917. By the way, I should mention Porfirio Diaz. Born September 15th in 1830. I wondered about even including him in this broadcast, or cable cast, I should call it. He was Mexico's long-lived 19th century president who was in and out of office, involved in one invasion, or one revolution and another. Was fiercely anti-clerical and anti-Catholic, and an important reformer and anti-cleric in Mexico during the mid-19th century. And he is still honored and revered in Mexico, and also a lot of people, very justifiably, condemn his memory because he became, like so many people who get to the top, he became a tyrant and ran the country to his own dictates. He was a rationalist, but he did, and he believed in the scientific method, built railroads, other roads, and telegraph lines, and helped bring Mexico into the 19th century. And he said that, he was running things as a semi-dictator, and he said he was going to bring back democracy, and then fraudulently got himself reelected. So, all free thinkers are not good guys, but Porfirio Diaz should be remembered, and there he is. On September 12th in 1960, in the middle of the presidential campaign, which he won, of course, as you all know, John F. Kennedy spoke to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association at the Rice Hotel in Houston. Throughout the South in America, which in 1960 was still basically Democratic, still voted Democratic, it looked like Kennedy might lose the South because so many Baptists, Methodists in the South were convinced that if a Catholic were elected president, he would be checking in with the Pope every morning to find out what he was supposed to do. I believe in an America where religious intolerance will someday end, where all men and all churches are treated as equal, where every man has the same right to attend or not attend the church of his choice, where there is no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no block voting of any kind, and where Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, at both the lay and pastoral level, will refrain from those attitudes of disdain and division which have so often marred their works in the past, and promote instead the American ideal of brotherhood. John F. Kennedy, September 12, 1960. Exactly 80 years before that, on September 12th in 1880, Henry Louis Mencken was born in Baltimore, where he lived the rest of his life, and where he became, working for the Baltimore Sun, one of the most respected and certainly one of the most widely read journalists in America. He was the son of an agnostic father, but a Lutheran mother, who sent him to Sunday school, which he later defined as a prison in which children do penance for the evil conscience of their parents. Mencken, we have to face it right up front, was a bigot and a racist, an anti-Semite. There's no getting around it. He was. On the other hand, he was one of the most incisive analysts of the American bourgeoisie, as he called it. He created the term Bible Belt, and the Bulbus Americanus, and his greatest fame came for his coverage of the Scopes trial in 1925. For the one or two people who might not know, John Scopes was indicted in the 1920s in Tennessee for the crime of teaching evolution, and the trial became a national cause. The O.J. Simpson trial of the 20s, okay, which brought in the famous Clarence Darrow to defend this young biology teacher, John Scopes, and which then caused the politician William Jennings Bryan to come in to represent the ignorant people who were trying to fine Scopes for the dastardly crime of teaching evolution. That was all brought together in the play and then film Inherit the Wind, starring Spencer Tracy and Frederick March, which was a huge hit 30 years ago, and brought the Scopes trial home for many Americans who knew nothing about it. Mencken covered the trial for both the Baltimore Sun and the Smart Set magazine, and his wit was what captured America. But he also, beyond the humor, beyond the wit, he came right in, he zeroed right in on the strain of know-nothingism that permeates much of American society. The idea that I don't think like those double-dome professors. I know what I was taught when I was 5 years old, and I'll never have to learn anything else again. The way to deal with superstition, Mencken wrote, in aftermath, which was his coverage of the Scopes trial for the Baltimore Sun. The way to deal with superstition is not to be polite to it, but to tackle it with all arms, and so rout it, cripple it, and make it forever infamous and ridiculous. Is it, perchance, cherished by persons who should know better? Then their folly should be brought out in the light of day, and exhibited there in all its hideousness until they flee from it, hiding their heads in shame. True enough, even a superstitious man has certain inalienable rights. He has a right to harbor and indulge his imbecilities as long as he pleases, provided only he does not try to inflict them upon other men by force. He has a right to argue for them as eloquently as he can, in season and out of season. He has a right to teach them to his children, but certainly he has no right to be protected against the free criticism of those who do not hold them. He has no right to demand that they be treated as sacred. He has no right to preach them without challenge. Did Clarence Darrow, in the course of his dreadful bombardment of Bryan, at the trial he's talking about, drop a few shells, incidentally, into measurably cleaner camps? Then let the garrisons of those camps look to their defenses. They are free to shoot back, but they can't disarm their enemy. This critic of the bourgeoisie is famous for many, many epigrams. I'm probably one of many thousands of small groups of college students who discovered Mencken, and each day when met up with friends said, "Did you read this? Did you read that?" And this was decades after Mencken wrote, but it was still fresh and witty. Faith may be defined briefly as an illogical belief in the occurrence of the improbable. The chief contribution of Protestantism to human thought is its massive proof that God is a bore. He wrote that in Minority Report in 1956. One that's very well known but usually misquoted. No one in this world, as far as I know, has ever lost money by underestimating the intelligence of the great masses of the plain people. Also, Sunday, a day given over by Americans to wishing that they themselves were dead and in heaven, and that their neighbors were dead and in hell. The Creator is a comedian whose audience is afraid to laugh. Wow. And then he wrote in Coda, in the Smart Set magazine, back in 1920, to sum up: 1. The cosmos is a gigantic flywheel making 10,000 revolutions a minute. 2. Man is a sick fly taking a dizzy ride on it. And 3. Religion is the theory that the wheel was designed and set spinning to give him the ride. Quote unquote. Theology, he wrote, is an effort to explain the unknowable by putting it in terms of the not worth knowing. And the most curious social convention of the great age in which we live is the one to the effect that religious opinions should be respected. I believe that religion, generally speaking, has been a curse to mankind, that its modest and greatly overestimated services on the ethical side have been more than overcome by the damage it has done to clear and honest thinking. Speaking of clear and honest thinking, he wrote, I believe that no discovery of fact, however trivial, can be wholly useless to the race, and that no trumpeting of falsehood, however virtuous in intent, can be anything but vicious. The whole thing, and this I'd like to call the sum up of Mencken's philosophy, As a matter of fact, George Seldes in Great Thoughts called this Mencken's Creed. The whole thing, after all, may be put very simply. I believe that it is better to tell the truth than to lie. I believe that it is better to be free than to be a slave. And I believe that it is better to know than be ignorant. H.L. Mencken, born September 12, 1880, and lived into the 1960s. This week in Atheist History, we have looked at the life and some of the writings of H.L. Mencken, the important writing and speech of John Fitzgerald Kennedy in Houston in 1960 about the separation of church and state. We mentioned the free-thinking, revolutionary, turned into tyrant Mexican Porfirio Diaz, and two of the most important women in free thought in America, Jessica Mitford, whose wonderful idea that embarrassing the guilty in society made her career, and perhaps most important of all, Margaret Sanger, who H.G. Wells said didn't just change things, she changed the world.
Wherever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers.